Before 1959, Cuba was one of the United States' closest allies, one of the most popular tourist sites for Americans to visit. However, in 1959, that all changed when a man named Fidel Castro led a revolution in Cuba and overthrew dictator Fulgencio Batista. From the beginning, President Eisenhower was concerned with the power and motives of Castro. When Castro's government confiscated American properties, the United States broke diplomatic relations. The U.S. then began to plot a way to overthrow him from power and implement a United States-friendly government. When John F. Kennedy took over as president in 1961, the plan to take out Castro only continued from the Eisenhower administration, and an economic embargo was imposed. Over the last 5 decades, the different leaders of the United States have had many difficult encounters with Castro, which has led to further political separation of the two countries. This is the story of how the leaders of the United States have combated the force of Fidel Castro since he took power in 1959.
It is important to restate what now divides Cuba from my country and from the other countries of this hemisphere. It is the fact that a small band of conspirators has stripped the Cuban people of their freedom and handed over the independence and sovereignty of the Cuban nation to forces beyond the hemisphere. They have made Cuba a victim of foreign imperialism, an instrument of the policy of others, a weapon in an effort dictated by external powers to subvert the other American republics. This and this alone divides us. As long as this is true, nothing is possible. Without it, everything is possible.
One of the first plots to kill Castro included a mobster named Sam Giancana. The plan was to insert a quick-dissolving pill filled with poison into Castro's tea by a hitman set up in Havana. The chief of the Office of Medical Services for the CIA Dirty Tricks Division, Dr. Edward Gunn, was tasked with making these pills. He made the pills of botulinum toxin to give to Giancana. However, the pills never made it to Havana because the hitman got cold feet. After the failed attempts to poison Castro internally, Major Orlando Cubela Sacatis was recruited to assassinate Castro. Cubela appeared to be the perfect man for the job because he was the number 2 man in Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil, which is an elite group of leftists that were dedicated to cleaning up the Havana government. Most important, Cubela despised Castro. He even said that he was so disgusted with Castro that if he did not get out of the country soon, he would end up killing Castro himself. When Cubela met with Bobby Kennedy, the plan was originally set up that the United States would provide support for the new Cuban government after Castro, and would provide a high-powered rifle to kill Castro at a distance. However, the plan was soon changed to injecting Castro with poison. Dr. Gunn was disguised a syringe full of poison into a ballpoint pen. However, the plan failed and Cubela was eventually seized by the Cuban government and sentenced to 10 years in prison. The biggest and boldest attempt to remove Castro from power was the Bay of Pigs. However, the invasion would end up being one of the biggest embarrassments of the United States' history. President Kennedy was facing immense pressure to attack Cuba and remove Castro from power once and for all. In a meeting with the chiefs in 1961, Kennedy was advised to begin an invasion of Cuba sooner rather than later because Castro was tightening police state controls within the area and also sending agents and arms into other countries of Latin America. Castro had been able to develop a great and striking personality throughout Latin America, and this gave him a great advantage. Admiral Burke agreed that there was a lack of a leader to rally around, and that somebody needed to fill this role. The Bay of Pigs was a project that was doomed from the start, due in large part to oversights and assumptions by the CIA. Publications that were released from the CIA clearly showed that Castro's forces would win the battle based off of sheer strength that Castro had obtained. The Castro forces outnumbered the American guerrilla forces almost 200 to 1. The CIA made a costly assumption in that the attackers would be scared off from the guerrilla forces and retreat. The main architect of the Bay of Pigs was Richard Bissell. The invasion was very unorganized and implications that the invasion could end up failing. But when the United States invaded Guatemala years before in the same fashion, the United States were able to win and implement a United States-friendly government. This then led Bissell to decide to continue on with the invasion plans. Another cause of the failed invasion was the landing area for American forces. Originally, the plan was to begin the strike in Trinidad so the forces could hide out in the mountains nearby. However, Kennedy decided to change plans and attack at the Bay of Pigs because of the swampy surroundings which kept Cuban forces from attacking at the sides. However, Bissell didn't fully tell the president of the risks involved with moving to the Bay of Pigs. While the swamps would protect the guerrilla forces, expanding forces with people from Cuba would not be able to come and help the United States. There was also no way for the guerrillas to make it to the mountains to escape from Castro's forces if need be. Bissell later admitted that he had no backup plan for the troops. Another reason Castro's forces were so successful in the Bay of Pigs was because it was later found that the Bay of Pigs was one of Castro's favorite fishing waters. He knew the area like the back of his hand, which helped him to orchestrate the army with great efficiency. On April 17, 1961, the United States infiltrated the Bay of Pigs. However, it soon became clear that the invasion was not going to be a success for the United States. One major reason was because of the morning airstrike from the Air Force was canceled because Kennedy wanted to avoid political anger from the world leaders. As a result, guerrilla forces were not clear from above, and Cuban airstrikes were able to sink critical ships, which included a ship that had 10 days' worth of food and ammo supplies. As a result, just 3 days after the invasion, the United States were forced to retreat, and the invasion became one of the most infamous wars in American history.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
The Americans' greatest fear had come true, and the Cubans and Soviets had formed an alliance. Now that the Soviet Union was just 90 miles away from launching missiles at the United States, President Kennedy had a duty to protect the United States from the potentially devastating missiles. After the Bay of Pigs, the Cubans became wary of the United States and believed another attack was soon to follow. For protection, Castro looked to Khrushchev in order for the Soviets to help protect the island of Cuba. After many long and difficult meetings, Kennedy decided to place a naval blockade, or a ring of ships, around Cuba. The aim of this quarantine, as he called it, was to prevent the Soviets from bringing in more military supplies, demand the removal of the missiles already there, and the destruction of the sites. No one was sure how the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev would respond to the naval blockade and the U.S. demands. But the leaders of both superpowers recognized the devastating possibility of a nuclear war and publicly agreed to a deal in which the Soviets would dismantle the weapon sites in exchange for a pledge from the United States not to invade Cuba. In a separate deal, which remained secret for more than 25 years, the United States had also agreed to remove its nuclear missiles in Turkey. Consequently of the missile crisis, an embargo was placed between the United States and Cuba that has lasted for more than 50 years. The embargo was originally placed in 1962 by President Kennedy to contain Cuba as a security threat. After the crisis, the embargo was kept in place as a policy intended to restore democracy in Cuba, a goal that was ill-equipped to achieve. The embargo restricted any trade or traveling between the two countries and, in a sense, completely separated the two countries from each other. In 1990, Bill Clinton decided to impose tougher sanctions on Cuba in an attempt to finally force the Cubans to convert to a democratic republic from the increased economic pressure.
We have promoted the free flow of ideas to Cuba. It will strengthen the embargo in a way that advances the cause of freedom in Cuba. Today, I sign it with the certainty that it will send a powerful, unified message from the United States to Havana, that the yearning of the Cuban people for freedom must not be denied.
When the tougher sanctions failed to gain any ground in turning Cuba into a democracy, many Democrats were in favor of lifting the embargo because it was felt that it was a failed policy that was hurting both countries rather than helping. On December 17, 2014, President Obama made one of the biggest announcements related to Cuba, saying that the United States and Cuba will begin to normalize relations. For the first time in over 50 years, the two countries are seriously engaged in overcoming their differences and working to end the hostilities between the two countries. Overall, Fidel Castro has lasted for more than 5 decades as arguably the greatest thorn in the United States' bush. He seemed to be the one man that the United States could never be able to remove from power through encounter after encounter. While the last 5 decades of battling Castro and Cuba were not the easiest and filled with war and mistrust, only the future will be able to determine whether or not the two sides will ever be able to become allies as they once were.
Good afternoon. Today, the United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba. In the most significant changes in our policy in more than 50 years, we will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests, and instead, we will begin to normalize relations between our two countries.